Добрый день, дорогие слушатели. У нас сегодня встреча с Стюартом Франклиным, фотографом, членом Magnum, директором Magnum в 2006-2009 году, профессором документальной фотографии. На встрече будет присутствовать также Владимир Балабнев, соавтор Стюарда по книге «Лондон глазами петербургского фотографа, Петербург глазами лондонского фотографа». Я хотел вас предупредить о том, что внизу на нижней панели вы можете выбрать дорожку перевода или русский, или английский язык, если вы выбираете... Да. Давайте тогда представим наших спикеров. Стюарт, добрый день.
Hello. Good afternoon. Good afternoon.
Владимир.
Здравствуйте все. Надеюсь, вам понравится и будет хорошая встреча у нас.
Отлично. Хорошо. Я начну задавать свои вопросы Стюарду. Зрители могут писать свои вопросы в чат, и я их озвучу непосредственно Стюарду. Хорошо. Стюарт, здравствуйте еще раз. Рад вас видеть. Я хотел начать...
Hi, Igor. Very nice to see you. And again, we in Magnum are hugely grateful to Manoj for launching the exhibition that's currently on in St. Petersburg. Thank you.
Да, спасибо Магнуму за такую возможность, потому что в Петербурге, кажется, не было еще ни одной подобной по масштабу выставки документальной фотографии. И для нас это большая радость, и все петербургское и российское фотосообщество, и просто зрители очень счастливы такой возможности. К тому же мы попросту никогда не видели многих материалов, потому что не все из этого было доступно зрителям. Еще раз спасибо.
I can't hear anything. So I'm waiting for some questions.
Простите. Да, я хотел начать издалека насчет вашего образования. Дело в том, что мне кажется, очень важно фотографу иметь хорошее гуманитарное образование. В вашем случае вы получили очень разностороннее образование. Сперва художественное образование, фотография и кинематография. Затем вы отучились в Оксфорде на географическом факультете, где сперва закончили бакалавриат, а потом получили докторскую степень и докторскую степень географических наук. Я хотел узнать, как это влияет, как серьезное академическое образование влияет на вашу фотографическую практику.
It's probably a disaster. You know, I think education is important for some people, but I don't think this kind of university education is essential for all photography or for all photographers. It's just a route I went down. I went down it because I don't know, I think it was Socrates who said in his trial, the unexamined life is not worth living. And I was working on, especially during the time I worked at National Geographic, quite complex environmental subjects that I really didn't understand. I didn't understand the background. I didn't understand actually what environmentalism meant. And so, yeah, I mean, so that's been very useful to understand some of the sort of roots into geography. It's been very important for me to understand you know, a lot of the history of art, literature, painting. I just have an unending curiosity. Life is a university in its own right. I could say more, if you like, about education.
Да-да, это интересная тема. Поскольку фотографы, зачастую фотографы идут люди с уже каким-то бэкграундом, с высшим образованием и приходят в эту профессию часто поздно, и это интересно наблюдать, как их высшее образование, иногда очень неожиданное, там, физиков, ядерщиков и так далее, влияет на их фотографическую практику. И мне кажется, мне эта тема кажется очень интересной.
I mean, a lot of the, you know, the photographers that we have in Magnum have taken a wide range of, have a wide range of educational backgrounds, you know, from psychology to chemistry to aircraft engineering. I mean, a sort of formal background in the arts and in photography isn't a requirement. It's just that photography becomes part of a road that people take in life. You know, you go through your life, and I mean, for example, you know, Lewis Hine, the American photographer working at the beginning of the 20th century, he was a geographer, but he used photography because as a tool to talk about children working in factories. You know, he taught himself photography in order to tell particular types of stories in a particular way. And Jakob Reese, the Danish journalist, did the same thing. You know, he's a journalist, but he wanted to talk about poor housing in New York. I think we educate ourselves, we read, we learn, we do whatever we need to do in order to do what we need to do. And if that's in photography, it's in order to support our practice in one way or another. And it doesn't have to be formal. It doesn't have to be in a university. There are so many ways to learn. You can have a mentor. You can hang around as Georgi Pinhasov did in the studio of Andrei Tarkovsky. You know, there are many ways to educate ourselves.
Да, я заметил очень странную вещь. Я не знаю, правило ли это, но мне показалось, что часто так, как, например, у вас первое ваше образование художественное, то же самое, например, и у Картье-Брессона, и есть очень странная закономерность, что люди, которые начинают с художественного образования, и первое время, так же, как вы, первые 2 десятилетия, как я понимаю, вы больше работали как фотожурналист и фотографировали, очень часто снимали в конфликтных горячих точках, в гражданские войны, голод и так далее. Но спустя 2 десятилетия вы возвращаетесь, я бы сказал, это как неким возвращением к поэзии, да, вы переключаетесь с фокуса социальной жизни, отношений внутри социума к отношениям общества и природы, и даже конкретного человека, то есть вас и природы. И нет ли в этом закономерности, как вы считаете? Нет ли, не закладывает ли художественное образование эту странную тягу к природе?
I think, you know, it's all part of life's journey. I don't think there are any rules to the way in which we move from decade to decade or project to project. It's true that at the beginning I worked for newspapers, I worked in news and then into breaking news with Agence Presse Sigma. So I was working for a French news agency, and they would send me to cover the news in the Middle East or in various other places. And you know, you become part of that becomes a job in a sense. And you don't really have time to reflect, particularly because you come back and then you go somewhere else, and there's a little time for reflection. But I think journalism is quite sort of deep in my DNA. And in fact, this year I've done 3 or 4 journalistic stories. One month in a hospital with COVID patients. So it's not like I have sort of left one part of my life and started another. It's rather that you know, certain things happen in your life and you want to reflect and you want to look at things in a different way. And I think that's what happened. When I stopped working with National Geographic, I spent more time working on my own books. And I think the first one was The Time of Trees, where I actually rather love trees. And I think they're an interesting sort of metaphor for our relationship with nature. And I decided to pursue that project in order to sort of, first of all, try to understand what environmentalism meant, try to understand what our relationship with trees and by extension the planet implied. And so I traveled to about 40 countries and that was published, I think it was 1999. And then, you know, actually the joy of being the author of one's own project, one's own books is quite infectious. And so I continued to sort of try to, if you like, contain the work that I was doing in book form and create photo books. So I think I kind of moved from the world of newspapers that was kind of managing my life, newspapers and magazines, to the world of books where I was kind of more or less in control of what I was doing as an author.
У меня есть очень общий вопрос. Есть разные способы рассказывать истории, но вы выбираете фотографию. И я хотел узнать, почему именно фотография? Как понять, что история должна быть рассказана именно фотографией? Потому что есть бесчисленное количество разных медиумов, чтобы рассказать эту историю.
It's a big question, isn't it? It's a question I put in front of all my master's students, in fact. Which medium is the best one for your story? Because photography doesn't work for quite a number of the stories that we want to tell. You know, for example, there was a German film that came out in 2017, I think, called Mein Blind Date mit dem Leben, which means my blind date with life. And it was telling the story of a blind man who was very, very keen to work in a 5-star hotel in Munich. And it recounted how he went for the interview and tried to hide the fact that he was blind, and then managed to, you know, make cocktails and all kinds of things without being able to see. And actually, it wouldn't even have worked as a documentary. It had to go into fiction to tell the story. It became a fictional account. So there are many, many ways of telling stories. I suppose I have found that for the most part, photography works for me, partly because a lot of I don't really need movement. I don't really need and I'm not working in a sort of didactic documentary way like somebody like Michael Moore or Ken Loach, where I'm trying to preach to you that, I don't know, gun ownership is bad, or that, you know, whatever. I like the sort of subtle art of photography where it allows, you know, it's more of an open work. It allows for the reader to make his or her own interpretations. And I think that's what's special about photography. It doesn't bring closure to the work in the way that quite a lot of documentary practice attempts to do. It tries to, in some ways, put across a point of view. It works through characters. So if you make a documentary film, the characters are the kind of vehicle for your story. Whereas I think in photography, it's much more free. You have an enormous amount of freedom, in fact, to construct a narrative or a way of seeing or a way of telling that I find very inspiring. Yeah.
А откуда вообще появляется это желание рассказывать истории? Потому что мы видим в истории искусства, в истории человечества, мы видим постоянное желание человека рассказать свою историю, начиная с наскальных надписей, с наскальных рисунков и заканчивая вашими книгами.
I mean, some people would argue that photography isn't very good at telling stories and has never pretended to be. You know, I think what's interesting is that photography allows for stories to be told when people look at it, not necessarily by the author, but by the spectator, in a sense. You know, if we watch a movie, you know, romantic movie, it will tell a story about, you know, how two people might have met and what happened to them in their relationship and so on. That is a story in the traditional sense of the word. If you look at the average photo book, it's not presenting a story, it's presenting a series of images where there's no final meaning. In fact, I've just got this book that I just wrote in front of me on ambiguity, and I'm quoting Tarkovsky, where he writes about non-linear narrative, and he says the image as a precise observation of life takes us straight back to Japanese poetry. What captivates me is the refusal even to hint at the kind of final image meaning that can be gradually deciphered like a charade. So what Tarkovsky's saying, and you could see it in his films like Mirror, is that he's not telling you how to a story. He's presenting you with a series of images from which you can find a story in his work. And that's what I think I try to do with, and many people, you know, try to do with photography.
Хорошо. Вы часто говорили о двусмысленности фотографии. Вы могли бы рассказать нам об этом подробнее?
I mean, it's a very complex subject, but I think that I would say that in photography, one of the sort of leading commentators back in the 80s on the idea of ambiguity was John Berger, you know, who wrote that all photographs are ambiguous because of their discontinuity, because of the fact that we don't know what happened before the photograph, we saw the photograph, and we don't know what happened afterwards, which again takes us back to the idea of narrative and us making up our own stories. I mean, that's part of the beauty, part of the allure of photography, of photographs, that we, in a sense, create our own stories. So that's one element of it, but there are many, many others. You know, there's the notion of space as well. The fact that we look at a frame, a photograph is in a frame or a box or a gallery, but what happens outside that frame, you know, in cinema, you know, you have things coming on and off the screen, and you have a sense of what's going on. In photography, there is only in photographs and of course in painting as well, the frame. So the writing I've done tends to, you know, I try to explore ambiguity like a stone with many sides, many facets, and look at different facets of the stone. You know, we look at, for example, we look at a painting by Manet, for example, and we say, okay, I can see you've painted this woman. I can also see that you're completely in love with her, you know, and so there's a lot of ambiguity in the images. You know, the same with Rembrandt's paintings of Henrike Stoffels. We can see the nature, in a sense, we can feel the nature of the relationship in the painting. So I'm kind of interested in the messages, the ambiguous messages that images give us, I guess.
Да, у меня в связи с этим у меня есть еще один вопрос по поводу специфики этого языка фотографии. Тут, присутствие этой же рамки, например, в кадре, необходимости селектировать реальность и самих правил грамматики языка. Из-за этих правил фотограф как бы все больше находится в рамках, и сам язык начинает диктовать ему то, что ему надо снимать, каким образом надо снимать. И есть опасность таким образом как бы все больше и больше отдаляться от реальности, от правды в кавычках. И как таким образом возможно передать эту правду, рассказать эту правду?
I think it's more about form or style than truth per se. I mean, if you consider that writers are faced with the same issues of trying to communicate as photographers in a certain way, and writers, you know, in order to be intelligible, for people to be able to understand what they're saying, tend to, you know, use words carefully to connect paragraphs. So there's a bridge between talking about one thing to talking about another to make it easier and in a sense more beautiful for the reader to understand and to read the story. The reason why, you know, Maxim Gorky's writing about his childhood is so special is the way he, you know, the beauty of the way he constructed it, the economy of the way he described, you know, two frogs on his at a funeral. It's the same with photography. We want to make, in a sense, it an uplifting experience to look at the work, or an engaging, or somehow to get inside us. I think that's what Tolstoy said in his little book on what is art. You know, it needs to infect us. So I think we're always trying to find ways to produce images that can somehow get inside you, that can somehow work, and that involves a certain aesthetic, a certain range of kind of aesthetic practices. But that none of those things have much to do with truth. They are more about form and style. Truth comes from inside you. You know, if you go out and you photograph, I don't know, a demonstration or whatever, you have choices as a photographer. You can choose this protagonist or that one, or you can photograph a brick wall. There are many things you can do. They're all essentially truthful aspects of that demonstration. And I think that it's up to us how we decide to frame or tell the story of particularly working in news, the world around us. But it essentially, you know, there is no, I don't think, overarching truth, even in, you know, any kind of news reporting, because there's so much subjectivity involved. There's so much baggage involved about what's been seen in the past and so on. On the other hand, what one doesn't want to be is dishonest, which is a different thing. I don't think you want to deceive people. I think it was Seamus Heaney, the Irish poet, who once said that the art of poetry is in undeceiving the world. And that's a different thing. That turns it on its head. It's not about truth, but it's not, it means that it's not about trying to deceive you. And I think that's more applicable, certainly, to documentary photography than hanging on this word truth.
Тут есть интересная тема и в условно художественной фотографии, не знаю, стоит ли их так делить. Например, в ваших двух последних книгах, там, в том числе в «Нарциссе», вы говорите о пейзаже как о зеркале, да? То есть мы, вглядываясь в него, мы всегда видим самого себя, как нарцисс видел всегда только свое отражение в ручье. И мне интересно как вы относитесь к этому взгляду? Мне кажется, что это одна из основных проблем, что мы не можем увидеть пейзаж как пейзаж, и мы всегда видим в нем... Для нас пейзаж всегда метафора чего-то другого, да? Метафора памяти, каких-то образов из нашей памяти и так далее, и так далее. И мне кажется, здесь есть опасность, и все страшные экологические катастрофы происходят именно из-за этого, из-за невозможности услышать сам пейзаж, услышать природу. И мне интересно, что вы об этом думаете. Возможно ли сделать наш взгляд менее антропоцентричным? Есть ли такая возможность?
But the thing is, you know, when you think of, it's easy to think of nature as somehow something, you know, that God created, and we were born into this sort of world of paradise. But you know, if you live in Europe as we do, you know, the broader geographical Europe, you know, most of the landscapes are created by man. You know, the man-made landscapes, the trees, the forests, they've all been cut, they've been grown, you know, from the days of Peter the Great, you know, grown for the Russian Navy. So, I mean, the issue is, when I look at nature and I look at my garden, you know, it's something that we've grown ourselves. I think, though, when I go out into, say, the landscape in Norway, when I was photographing narcissus, what I was really reflecting on, and I think I used the quote by Merleau-Ponty where he says, we see the world through the spectacles of memory. What I was really trying to drive at is that when we look at landscape, we're drawn by certain kinds of form, certain aspects of the landscape that remind us of things. It might be, I don't know, our mother's breast. It might be an arm. It might be something we remember as a baby or as a child that informs our practice, the way we are particularly drawn to shapes, forms, and all kinds of things, rather than, I don't think it's possible to view landscape other than anthropocentrically. I mean, even your great writer, Turgenev, when he was writing the Hunter's Album, and very attuned to nature, attuned to the way the birds in the early morning were getting up, one after the other. And you could have sort of read Turgenev and said, oh, you know, this is great. He's listening to the birds and the way that, you know, at 4 o'clock we hear one bird, at 5 o'clock we hear another. But it's still essentially an anthropocentric view. It's a hunter's view of the landscape. And I don't think any of us can see it any differently.
Да, спасибо большое. Я хотел узнать насчет иконических изображений. Дело в том, что вы сняли несколько фотографий, которые стали иконами, и мне интересно, что делает фотография иконой, что делает фотография иконой.
I think it's a rather overused idea. You know, I think quite often what makes an iconic photograph in the political world is probably its political application. And that's very different from just great photographs. I mean, we would say, if we call photographs iconic because they are just extraordinarily beautiful photographs, like some of Henri Cartier-Bresson's that you have in the exhibition, or some of Georgi Pinhasov, or whatever. These are iconic because they're just gorgeous photographs. I don't think mine are iconic. I just think that they were labeled. I mean, the Tiananmen Square image, for example, was probably labeled an iconic image because it was politically expedient at the time. it showed that, it showed that it showed a level of restraint. That the tank wasn't running this guy down, so it was very useful for George Bush Senior. It was also very useful for the Chinese government, but also it was symbolic of, very symbolic of the human being against the kind of juggernaut of the state. So it had all kinds of political symbolism entrained in it. And of course, it's been described as an iconic photograph, but that doesn't necessarily mean it's a good photograph or a great photograph always. Does that make sense? As a photograph, as an image.
Спасибо большое. К бюрократическим делам возвращаясь. Вы занимали пост директора Magnum с 2006 по 2009 год. И в чем заключается работа директора Magnum? Почему директор Magnum выбирается из фотографов? И отвлекало ли вас это от вашей деятельности как фотографа?
Well, the thing is that Magnum is a cooperative. It was founded in 1947, and it was always, directed by the body of the photographers. So somebody was elected to kind of provide some oversight to what was going on and to deal with people's concerns and also our relationship with the staff and the outside world. And we've sort of since 1947 got a bit larger, and every 2 or 3 years another person comes along to be president, as that person's called. But essentially the role is to try to sort of create a communicative space between the photographers and between the photographers and the staff, and to make the whole thing kind of roll forward and to manage issues and concerns that that come up in very changing times, so don't forget, we've had to deal with the period in the mid-90s of digitization. So there are always decisions to be made about how we digitize our archive, how we do this, how we do that. And these are the kinds of things that not just the president, you don't work in isolation. You work with a board, a very capable group of people who, help to sort of formulate kind of policy, if that's the right word, or at least, a way of kind of moving forward. I think the thing is always, how do we move forward from here to there? And there are always challenges, but because the nature of the industry is always changing. We grew up in a world of, myself and people of my age, I'm 64, we all grew up in a world of sort of newspapers and magazines and the printed page. Well, that's changed radically. So, we always have to work out how we're going to move forward. So it's these kinds of things that occupies the president. But I think one of the most important roles is keeping a dialogue, keeping communication and listening to everybody and trying to sort of make it work. If that answers your question.
Да. Расскажите о своей педагогической деятельности. Много ли вы сейчас преподаете и как это сочетается с вашей творческой работой?
Well, I don't just teach when I work with students, I learn as well, because I think that teaching is a two-way street. I think on the one hand, we raise and discuss ideas, but on the other hand, I think the students are fabulous because, they have ideas that are really valuable and important, and we kind of bounce them together. So I hold a 50% professorship in a Norwegian university in Volda University College, and I teach in documentary photography. That's my field. But I also teach because you know, my view is that we live in complex times, and I think it's important for undergraduates and graduates to have a broader sense of the history of issues such as gender and race. I also teach quite a lot about the humanities in general, you know, the history of representation, for example, of Africa, which were things that I taught at Oxford when I'd left studying geography. And these are really important issues in my view. I think students have to be prepared as they go out into the world for to meet a very complex world in terms of you know, the people's sensitivities, and so preparing students to meet that world is definitely part of my agenda. But also, as my students will tell you, I don't stay on the road of photography. A lot of the images that I put up on the screen are paintings, or sculptures. You know, it doesn't really matter to me. I try to get photography, cinema. You know, I'll show a film clip by Rossellini and talk about Italian New Wave cinema, or Ken Russell's documentary films. It's important to, you know, when we talk about montage, you know, for example, we talk about bookmaking, you know, I take us back to your great filmmaker Sergei Eisenstein, or Ziga Vertov, or, you know, whatever. You know, these are really important. They, you know, cinema informed, early cinema informed the way we put images together, the way we use juxtaposition and so on. So yeah, I love the range of possibilities when it comes to teaching, and I think the students enjoy that as well. Anything is possible. I think the most important thing is, you know, to dig inside yourself, and at the same time to look at the world outside, and have the skills to be able to produce a series of photographs that are meaningful and are poignant, and that have, you know, that are honest in every sense of the word.
Спасибо за ваш ответ. Тут также есть вопрос от зрителя по поводу вопроса обучения, чтобы продолжить эту тему. Если рассматривать получение степени магистра фотографии, куда вы посоветуете поступать? Какие университеты сейчас наиболее прогрессивные в этой сфере в мире или более узко в Европе?
It's hard to say. I don't really have a big overview. I mean, and also, of course, if you're in Russia, it's a case of you know, where you can get to. I mean, I've taught actually Russian students in Hanover, which is a University of Arts and Sciences, which is great. I've taught at SPAOS in Paris, which is great. I teach a documentary course at the London College of Communication, which is great. But it's not just me, but there are lots of people out there doing interesting things. But I think you could, you know, there are ways of researching it on the internet through, you know, the various journals of photography occasionally do features on photographic education and where's a good place to be. And you have to find, you know, it's a lot about the practicalities, the grants, the cost of being there, and so on and so forth. But I think that one of the interesting things about the COVID pandemic is that there's a lot more teaching going on online. So kind of Zoom teaching is something that I've been doing with my students since March. And actually it works pretty well. It works well in a plenary session where you're lecturing to maybe 30 or 40 people, because you can just turn the screen around. And it works very well in a tutorial way, in that you can just deal one-to-one with a student, look at their work, talk about their work. and so on. So it's actually probably, we're probably going to see more of that kind of education, if you like, kind of digital learning in the future. And I think it's, you know, there are probably going to be some really good opportunities out there for that kind of thing. I mean, you don't necessarily need to have a master degree, you know, stamp to be a successful photographer. What you need, I think, is probably to listen to, reach out to a number of practitioners or teachers and try to work out your best way forward.
Спасибо. Я хотел подключить к нашей беседе Владимира Балабнева, соавтора стюардов по книжке о Лондоне и Санкт-Петербурге. Он расскажет о проекте. И, Владимир, вы не против, если я не буду делать демонстрацию экрана, или смогут увидеть эти работы на выставке?
Очень жаль.
Боюсь проблем с демонстрацией.
Потому что рассказ интересный. Мне казалось, что было бы интересно показать фотографии. Ну ладно, ничего, конечно. Ну, я вас не слышу.
Да, простите, у меня, не знаю, в чем дело. У меня неполадки со связью или у вас?
Нет, у меня все в порядке, наверное.
Да, извините,
То есть,
я не слышал вас.
То есть я могу начать рассказывать про свой проект, да?
Да.
Ну, мне очень приятно, что мне удалось поработать со Стюартом. Замечательный фотограф, в хорошем агентстве работает. Вот. И до нашей встречи мне уже приходилось делать свои проекты, в которых я участвовал полностью как автор. Вот. Ну и, значит, идея создания фотоальбома «Лондон глазами петербургского фотографа» и «Петербург глазами лондонского фотографа» пришла мне в 2005 году. После выхода фотокниг «Париж, Петербург», «Венеция, Петербург» и «Амстердам, Петербург». Но это были мои альбомы, которые я сделал один. Вот. Там я проводил параллели между Петербургом и перечисленными городами. Вот. Но в данном случае мне хотелось отобразить такую культурную столицу, как Лондон, и в этом же контексте показывать его было нельзя. То есть они совершенно разные города, и параллели там было очень сложно проводить. Вот. И мне в голову пришла идея пригласить соавтора еще одного фотографа, который займется Петербургом. То есть я решил снимать как петербургский фотограф Лондон и лондонского фотографа задействовать на съемку в Петербурге. Вот. Шло время, и так как я до этого не был в Великобритании, то я стал готовиться к поездке, читал английскую литературу, прочитал много книг по искусству, слушал музыку, дегустировал виски. Вот. А английскую кухню решил оставить уже по приезде, попробовать уже на месте. Вот. Наконец, настал тот день, когда все-таки в этих проектах очень важна еще и финансовая составляющая. И одна из компаний петербургских решила меня поддержать и выделила мне некую сумму денег. Вот. И после этого мне нужно было уже найти коллегу-фотографа, желательно проживающего в Лондоне. Вот, конечно же, могло уйти много времени на это. Я делал поиски, там, писал письма. Вот. Но, как всегда, помог случай. Я зашел в книжный магазин и увидел на полках фотографический журнал на английском языке. И там была статья про Стюарта которой было написано, что он замечательный фотограф. И самое главное, то, что мне импонировало, импонировали 3 факта. Мне понравились его фотографии, то, что он родился в Лондоне, это очень тоже важно. И немаловажная деталь, он работал в Магнуме. Еще с советских времен я помнил, что это одно из самых значительных фотоагентств в мире. И там случайных людей не бывает. Вот, поэтому как-то в этом отношении подошел по всем статьям, получается, Стюарт. Я написал ему письмо с предложением принять участие в проекте. Благо в статье был адрес, имейл. Но он не заставил себя долго ждать и ответил положительно, что ему понравилась сама идея, и он хочет принять в этом участие. У нас началась с ним переписка о намерениях, в которой я сообщил ему, что особых условий по съемке Петербурга у меня к нему не будет. Я полагаюсь на его творческий опыт. Это должен быть взгляд на город и его жителей, человека из другой культурной среды. Единственное пожелание было, чтобы не было использовано стереотипов о России. Вы знаете, когда приезжают иностранцы, они попадают впервые в Петербург, то это часто случается. Наши съемки, когда мы уже договорились обо всем, уже и о гонораре, и значит, командировках, которые тоже нужно было оплачивать и размещать Стюарта, вот, мы перешли уже к самой съемке. Съемка проходила в период с 2007 по 2011 год. Каждый из нас осуществил по несколько командировок. Вот. В процессе съемок у меня происходило много интересных моментов, смешных и не очень. Я думаю, что можно даже рассказать эти случаи, они связаны только с фотографией, и они достоверны. То есть это то, что происходило со мной. Вот первый такой случай произошел в очередной поездке. Я делал фотографии в Грин-парке. Мне надо было сфотографировать Букингемский дворец через решетку парка. Я поставил камеру с большим объективом на штатив. В общем, только начал примеряться, как ко мне подошел человек в штатском и спросил, что я тут снимаю, и не профессиональный ли я фотограф. Я ему честно все рассказал, что я делаю книгу про Лондон. В общем, сдал себя со всеми потрохами. Вот. На что он сказал, что нельзя здесь фотографировать со штатива, чтобы я убирался восвояси. Я его попросил, что можно сделаю я только одну фотографию. Ну, он разрешил, и в этот момент в мой кадр въехала карета с черными рысаками. Я нажал на спуск. В итоге эта фотография попала потом в мой фотоальбом. Этот гражданин потом достал тетрадку и выписал мне протокол. После объявил, что если я буду использовать эту фотографию в коммерческих целях, то я должен заплатить. Вот. Ну и после этого я решил, что не буду в дальнейшем использовать штатив и буду прикидываться любителем, потому что какая-то ситуация непонятная. Ну, следующий пикантный случай произошел со мной возле моста Эбери. Я шел по улице, а навстречу шла негритянская семья. Что-то шумно рассказывая друг другу. Я начал их фотографировать, и какая-то бешеная мамаша начала кричать на меня, позвонила в полицию. Через 3 минуты этот полицейский стоял возле меня и спрашивал, что я тут делаю вообще, зачем я фотографирую. Вот. Попросил у меня документы. Вот. Я достал из кармана достал красную паспортину гражданина Российской Федерации. Он не разобрался, что это такое, так, листая, начал шумно переговариваться по рации, что у меня паспорт СССР. Вот. В общем, как-то ввел меня в какой-то стопор. Вот. Я задумался, а какой сегодня год вообще? Что это вообще происходит такое? Потом вспомнил, что у меня есть с собой ID-карта, и уже из маленького карманчика я достал европейский вид на жительство, и полицейский успокоился. Вот. Так я понял, что холодной войны не будет. Ну, заставил меня удалить последние фотографии. Слава богу, не увидел фотографии уже за 5 минут до этого инцидента. Я снял детей уже, с белыми детьми, фотографии сделал, вот, которые я сделал на фоне электростанции Беттерси. Ну, это знаковое место такое, очень интересное. Вот. Но эта фотография, все-таки самое главное, что эту фотографию мы не удалили, и она вошла в альбом, и как бы такая. Вот. Но еще один случай, тоже в Сити это было. Я шел по улице и увидел, что полицейские разбираются с подростками, которые ехали на велосипеде. Что-то они там тоже были недовольны. Я начал эту сценку фотографировать, и один из полицейских подошел ко мне и сказал, что нельзя фотографировать, и заставил меня стереть эти фотографии. Я после этого подумал, что если я так дальше буду продолжать стирать фотографии, то на альбом я точно не соберу фотографии. И как-то здесь совершенно ужасный момент. Но я думаю, у Стюарта тоже могут какие-то интересные такие моменты по Петербургу. Он же в Петербурге 2 раза приезжал осенью и зимой, вот, и в 25-градусный мороз тут фотографировал. Наверное, тоже что-нибудь расскажет. Вот. Ну и последняя такая пикантная история, которая со мной случилась в мою вторую поездку. Это был ноябрь 2009 года. Тогда свирепствовал свиной грипп. Эта тема как раз сейчас актуальна в связи с пандемией. Так вот, на 3-й день пребывания в Лондоне я почувствовал легкое недомогание. У меня поднялась температура, заболело горло, потекло из носа. Вот. Я подумал, все, я заболел гриппом. Вот пришла моя погибель здесь. Но все же на следующее утро пошел снимать в Сити. Помню, что мне стало очень плохо, и там была ступенька ниже тротуара. Я сел на эту ступеньку, вот, и тут же увидел хороший кадр. Так как я был ниже линии тротуара, то люди, проходящие на фоне небоскребов, очень замечательно смотрелись. В общем, в этот день я сделал только одну фотографию, которая вошла в альбом. Вернулся в отель, вот, и обнаружил, надо было лечиться, надо было как-то, хотя я приезжал максимум на 10 дней, тоже не мог себе позволить отлеживаться, даже по болезни, отлеживаться где-то там в отеле. И я, придя в номер, заметил, что заблаговременно взял с собой из Питера какой-то английский порошок типа Coldrex. Вот. Сделал из него шипучку. Потом тут же я увидел, что на тумбочке у меня стоит бутылка виски, которую купил в Лондоне. Вот и первачок, подумал я. У кого-то, может, конечно, возникнут другие ассоциации с этим словом, но, честно говоря, мне тогда было не до шуток. Вот. Это был 2009 год, свинячий грипп косил всех подряд, поэтому было так очень. Вот. Но, хотя я вспомнил тут же, как мы шутили в советское время, если ты зашел в фотолабораторию и по ошибке выпил проявитель, то доведи процесс до конца, выпей и закрепитель. Но все же я не стал делать коктейль из этих 2 составов, выпил только Coldrex. В итоге все закончилось хорошо, благополучно, никакая пандемия меня не помешала закончить эту съемку в Лондоне. Так как я был автором проекта, то мне приходилось заниматься всеми вопросами, возникающими в процессе работы над фотоальбомом. Ну и уже в 2012 году, как раз это была Олимпиада в Лондоне, за неделю до открытия Олимпийских игр в Лондоне, я выпустил наш общий фотоальбом, вышел тепленьким из уютной типографии петербургской. Вот. И уже осенью того же 2012 года так получилось, что я привез этот фотоальбом и сделал презентацию в Лондоне, и там же показал выставку, свою выставку фотографий, моего питерского взгляда на этот прекрасный город. Вот. Ну и если есть желающие, сейчас проходит выставка Магнума, и этот же наш альбом, наш коллективный такой тандем, этот альбом можно полистать и увидеть на втором этаже в экспозиции. Так что, ну, я думаю, что теперь можно передать слово Стюарту, и он нам тоже что-нибудь интересное расскажет. Я думаю, что он проникся этим проектом и что-нибудь расскажет про Петербург.
Спасибо, Владимир.
Yeah, thank you, Vladimir. It brings back extremely, can you hear me? Yes. Brings back fabulous memories of that time. I was sort of 10 years ago or so, going to St. Petersburg and meeting Vladimir, who of course, he didn't tell you the other reason why he invited me onto the project, which was that we have our birthday on the same day. Anyway.
Ну, день разницы. У нас это ровно 10 лет разницы и один день. Вы 16 июня, я 17 июня, да. Так что, да.
That's right, yeah. Anyway, it's very, very kind and good memories. And so one of the joys of going to St. Petersburg, and I think my first trip was in the winter, was that my daughter, Maisie, was studying Russian at Edinburgh University. And I thought it'd be really, because I hadn't seen much of her while she's been away studying, and she spent a year in Ekaterinburg. And I thought it'd be a really nice opportunity to spend some time with her and to sort of explore St. Petersburg together. So essentially on the first trip, I think it was the three of us, myself, my daughter, and Vladimir. And we, you know, St. Petersburg is a fantastic walking city. It's one of those cities where, a bit like, I don't know, Buenos Aires, they're a city, Paris, you can walk for miles and miles and still continue to enjoy walking. And really that's what we did. And one of the lovely things about photography is that, you know, you can just find things by accident. So quite a lot of what I did while working on that book with Vladimir was just things that I came across by accident, getting on buses, walking down Nevsky Prospect, going to the Alexander Nevsky monastery, and of course there, one of my favorite photographs in that series that you saw is actually the photograph of the composer Dargomishki, and he has a flute and he's playing it. And of course, we talked earlier in this conversation about, you know, what is the role of photography and do we need words? And of course, Dargomishki, I think he said something like, I want sound directly to express the word. So he was, you know, really pretty innovative in the world of opera. Anyway, I just thought it was a terrific time. I didn't have any real bad experiences at all. I found people extremely friendly, helpful, and then of course I went in the spring, which was when I shot the Dargomishki picture. But it was probably, for me, looking back at some of the photographs, probably most amazing in the snow, in the ice, you know, when the Neva River is frozen over. And I'd often go back to the same places because I kept changing, the light kept changing. I think about several times to the Hermitage Museum, which again is an absolute treasure, hugely inspiring. And say, you know, the room in the Hermitage where you have Matisse's painting of the dance. You also have other things going on, the way people interact with paintings, the guards who sit on chairs and watch everybody. So, you know, going back to me talking about space and ambiguity, that's one of the photographs I put into that book. I haven't been back since, but I'd be very happy to go. And in fact, probably if it weren't for this COVID pandemic, well, definitely I would be back, you know, to see this extraordinarily unmissable exhibition in Manège. But I'm hugely grateful to Vladimir for inviting me. I felt very honored to have been part of this project, and the book, of which I only have one copy sitting here in my bookshelf, is in fact a real treasure. And of course, not just mine, but Vladimir's pictures. I noticed when Vladimir was walking around London, one of the things he noticed was a London taxi cab with Russian writing on the side. And, so that must have been something that made him feel at home, at least one of the things that made him feel at home in London. But yeah, it was, these journeys are just lovely. And as I say, you know, one of the things is taking the photographs and walking around. Another thing is building, if you like, the sequence, building the images so that they kind of flow coherently. And, you know, one of the things that I think both of us would say we try to do is to, especially important in bookmaking, is to have a sense of coherence. So the pictures, the book doesn't look like it was taken by 10 or 15 photographers, but by two, by Vladimir in London and me in St. Petersburg. So, you know, one of the things I think all of us who make books in photography try to do is to develop a level of consistency and coherency. And it's one of the things I try to, I talk to my students about. You know, the last thing you want is a photo book that looks like it's taken by 20 people when it's taken by one. And of course, it's the same with writing or whatever. Anyway, I don't want to bore you and go on and on, but it was a lovely project. And of course, I hugely enjoyed being in St. Petersburg. And I'd happily go back anytime and drink vodka. Right, over to you, Igor.
Да, спасибо большое. Лондонскому фотографу в Петербурге было гораздо легче, чем петербургскому в Лондоне. Интересная специфика России. А я хотел узнать, какой вы ресерч предварительно, какое исследование вы предварительно делаете, прежде чем ехать на съемки, например, прежде чем поехать в Петербург. Что вы изучаете? Как докторская степень по географическим наукам в Оксфорде, может быть, была такая же серьезная подготовка для исследования России?
Now, the thing is that these days, you know, I mostly write my own copy when I do essays. So at the moment, I'm working on one for the Sunday Times, the COVID story I wrote myself. So when I'm doing my own text, I do a huge amount of research because that sort of determines more or less the directions I'm going in. In St. Petersburg, I wasn't writing the copy for the book. They had hired a writer. So I didn't really have to, I mean, I'd done some research and I was kind of, you know, I looked at sort of guidebooks and I think read one or two books about St. Petersburg, but I didn't do a lot because what I wanted to do is kind of let the city speak to me. I didn't really want to have any particular preconceptions. I wanted to walk through the city and see how, you know, I've see what it's like. I'm kind of vaguely interested in, you know, the parts of the city where, for example, Dostoevsky lived, and you know, other kind of cultural landmarks. The kind of cultural landmarks are important to me, of course, as well. So I made sure I got to those. But in terms of, you know, it's not a geography project. It was a photo essay. If you see what I mean.
Спасибо. У нас много вопросов от зрителей. Я зачитаю сейчас какие-нибудь из них. Сейчас, одну минуту.
Sure.
Ага, вопрос от Сергея, я не вижу фамилии. Добрый день, типичный сейчас вопрос, но интересно, что думает об этом такой человек. Какова жизнь фотоистории в нынешнем срезе времени, если не говорить о фотокнигах? Какова жизнь фотоистории в нынешнем срезе времени? В изданиях траты на фоторепортажи сокращаются и сокращаются, просмотров они много не приносят, подход к картинке у обычного человека вообще поменялся, все листается как Google Images.
Well, in Russia, you had a very famous agricultural economist called Chayanov, who said once that farming was self-exploitation. And I think that today, photography, documentary photography is a perfect example of a Chayanovian act of self-exploitation, because we spend an awful lot of time and money and very rarely get it back when we go out and do photo books. And the more intense and meaningful personally the work, the less you know, reward, economic reward there is. So it's like that. There are still magazines, and it is still possible to work in that traditional way. And in fact, this year I've done 3 or 4 commissions for magazines. One for the New York Review of Books about the landscape in Los Angeles of the crime writer James Ellroy. And again, that was commissioned largely because I was going to deliver the text and the photo essay, which again, I elected to shoot on film, which added to the cost, but I really wanted to work on film and not digitally. The second story I did this year, another story was 2 or 3 stories on the COVID pandemic. You know, that was commissioned by a magazine, and the story I'm working on at the moment, which I can't really talk about, for the Sunday Times magazine, was commissioned for photography and text. So the thing is that I guess as I get older, I'm more interested in sort of writing and photographing as well when I work in an editorial way. I believe words, you know, contextualizing things adds a lot to if you like, a story. And of course you can have work with a writer, but very few people have got the money to send both a photographer and a writer. So I'm now often going on my own, and I've done it many times for many different magazines. So if that's the question, that's my answer. In terms of digital work, yeah, there are online, of course, there are online magazines and online journals and so on and so forth. But and the format isn't that different. I mean, I did a digital piece for The Guardian not long ago, and it was, again, photography, a photo essay and text. But you know, I don't know what the future holds, but I think, but what I do know is that photography has today and will always have an incredibly important place in the history of, and in the world of communications. It's a very different thing. As I said earlier, it's a much more ambiguous space. It's very personal. It's incredibly strong in areas where the subject doesn't move, such as portraiture and landscape, which of course are largely unattractive to television and filmmakers. So in the world of portraiture, photography will always be hugely important, I think. Does that answer your question? Sorry.
Боюсь, что мы не услышим комментарии Сергея. Спасибо большое. Я хотел еще вернуться к теме ваших русских съемок. Вы приезжали в Россию также в 95-м, кажется, году в Москву. И мне интересно, насколько это разные страны. Россия в 95-м году и Петербург в 2007-2010. Конечно, Москва и Петербург — это вообще немного разные страны. Вот. Но сам воздух, внешний вид людей, насколько все это изменилось и как это можно описать?
I think my memory of Moscow is really vague in that I think I was only there for about 3 or 4 days. And the main thing was the May 1st events in Red Square, if I remember correctly, which was an assignment. I don't remember from who. And so I was sort of there photographing and then left. I do remember, you know, finding Moscow slightly less, you know, more difficult to get around because I didn't have Russian and I was sort of on my own. So I'd sort of go into the subway and I really got lost, badly lost in the subway because everything was in Russian and nobody would, you know, would help. But, you know, it was fine. The assignment was, you know, in the end, okay. But it was very sort of locally organized. I didn't really see much of Moscow or much of Russia, if I recall, at that point. I went later to work on my book on landscape up to Murmansk and Monchegorsk. And that was fine. That was pretty easy. I had a good assistant to work with up there and, you know, it was no problem. But again, I went to shoot one thing, which was a nickel cadmium mine. 2006, I think, 7, yeah.
Спасибо. У нас есть еще вопросы от зрителя. Теодор спрашивает, скажите, считаете ли вы для себя возможным работу над нон-дидактик книгами, такими как «Аналогии» и «Нарцисс», в начале вашей карьеры? Как рано вы начали думать о воплощении этих идей в форме проекта?
That's a really good question. I think, you know, at the beginning of my career, you know, when I was young, in my 20s, you know, I had children and, you know, a new house and things like that. And I really didn't feel particularly free. I felt very much the responsibility of paying all the bills and so on and so forth. So I think I was really focused, not so much on my own work, but simply working within photojournalism, which was my job. So I would, you know, work for newspapers and then, you know, with Sigma and then at the beginning with Magnum. And I think moving really from one sort of story to another and the kind of luxury of sitting back and taking a few months off to do a book I never really had until, you know, the late 1990s when my kids were older and so on. But after that and after finishing working with National Geographic, it became much easier and much more possible to do that. And in fact, one book, a book on the British coast, was commissioned as a whole book in the same way as the St. Peter's book was. So it took a while, is what I want to say. On the other hand, I'm seeing students now. I mean, one of my students produced a book, an extension of the work she had done with me, the year after leaving university. So everybody's different. I just took a long time, but I think that if you look at the student body now, a lot of young people are very focused on trying to get a book done, and they're very, you know, many of them very clear about what they want to do.
Спасибо, спасибо. У нас есть еще один интересный и важный вопрос. Возвращаясь к съемке и мукам русского фотографа в Лондоне, спрашивает Алексей Ларченко. Здравствуйте, Стюарт. Как вы относитесь к общемировому тренду ухудшения отношения людей к фотографам? Все больше фотографирования на улице без спроса воспринимается как нападение. При этом эти же люди ходят на фотовыставки и восхищаются работами фотографов прошлого. Что движет этим изменением, по-вашему?
I mean, you know, having been photographing in the world and in the street for, I don't know how many years, 35 years, I think it's like anything. There are no real rules. I mean, you can normally tell if you're going to upset somebody by approaching them with a camera. And generally speaking, if I feel that I'm going to upset somebody, I tend not to do it. Other people have a different point of view, but that's my feeling, and it's not. I don't think there are rules, and obviously the context of things is very different. If it's a new situation, you know, whereas I was, you know, a demonstration or something, then it's kind of, you know, open season. But if it's you know, outside a kid's school or something, it's a completely different kind of scene. So I think every scenario is different in the way that you approach it as a photographer. So I think if I was trying to photograph mothers collecting their kids from school, I would definitely ask if they minded and explain what I was doing and who I was, because otherwise they're going to think, who is this guy? You know what I'm saying? So every context is differently. I don't think you can create a sort of blanket concept of what is right and wrong or good and bad at all.
Спасибо. Вопрос от Ильи Конева. Почему одиночный снимок отошел на второй план, а в моде сейчас фотоистории?
Yeah, I'm not sure, because, you know, when you look at painting, you know, we look at single paintings, don't we? You go into the, I don't know, the Hermitage, you know, you go from single painting to single painting. I'm not sure why that is the case. I suppose today with things like Instagram, where essentially there are so many single images, you know, millions and millions of them, and you know, at least when you look at a series, it gives you a sense of depth to the work, a sense of commitment to the subject or the story, whereas a single picture sometimes feels less committed to a subject and provides less information or whatever. I think that, I mean, I think a series of photographs, especially as I was saying, I'm involved in now, more connected to a text, allows the reader or the spectator to sort of go inside the work to understand what the work is doing, what it's saying as a larger thing. Single images are beautiful. many of them are captivating, but somehow they're harder to, because there are so many of them out there, they're harder to engage with because for various reasons. But I'm not sure why completely.
Спасибо, спасибо. В ответ вопрос от Олега Прозорова. Что вы думаете о работе фотографа или журналов мод? Можно ли считать этот жанр фотографии разновидностью документальной фотографии? В чем их сходство и различия?
I mean, probably not, because you know, the aim of fashion photography is to sell clothes, and therefore, you know, it's a product. It's product photography, which is commercial, and it has a commercial agenda. Whereas I think what we consider to be documentary photography doesn't really begin with a commercial agenda. It begins with an agenda of trying to sort of set out photographically what's going on in the world, what's going on around us. Obviously, you know, with time and in certain contexts, the world of fashion plays into the world of documentary. I mean, you can create a sort of Venn diagram where the two, you know, connect, and there's an overlap. But I think they kind of begin from slightly different principles. But I've got nothing against fashion photography. It's just, it is a world. It's sort of starting principle is selling clothes, if I'm not mistaken.
Спасибо. И вопрос от Нелли. Как рождается замысел для того или иного проекта? Сперва появляется сама идея, и Стюарт работает над ней, или его что-то сперва задевает, вдохновляет, и это уже направляет к дальнейшей работе над целым проектом?
It can be a whole range of different things. I mean, for example, I had been teaching about African societies in transition at Oxford, and I'd looked at different ways in which, you know, different representations of Africa, I guess. And so I decided to do a book called Hotel Afrique, which was looking at kind of elite spaces in Africa. And it came from that. It really just depends on everything in life, in a way, comes down to chance, you know, where, you know, generally, but also sometimes it's very personal. You know, the landscape work I did, the 2 books recently, Analogies and Narcissus, are quite personal work. The work I'm doing at the moment is quite personal work. You know, the COVID story largely came about because my wife's a doctor working in an emergency department, so we had the access to do the story. Everything is, you know, sometimes it's just somebody ringing up and saying, would you be interested in this or that? There are a whole ranges of things that kind of fly in at you, and then you go, yeah, that's great. But I think somehow to do a story well, you have to kind of be invested in it, in a sense. You have to feel like you can put part of yourself into it to get the most out of it. If you're not invested in the story, if you're not invested in the subject, it becomes like work. And the bizarre thing is that we always talk about work when we talk about photography, but it's never really felt like work to me. It's more like play. I really enjoy what I do, and when it becomes like work, then it's kind of, maybe I'm on the wrong subject.
Спасибо. У нас последний вопрос, нам надо заканчивать. Он очень, очень сложный. Артем Голубятников спрашивает, скажите, что для вас красота?
That's complicated. It's very complicated. You know, the one thing about beauty is that, you have to take away the idea that it's a purely visual thing. Beauty has nothing to do with just the eyes. It has to do with many things, in my humble view. And once you take it away from something you see, then the meaning unravels itself a little bit more. It's probably easier to talk about beauty in music than it is in images. It's also incredibly confusing subject because, you know, when people used to talk about beauty in the past, in the, for example, the 18th century, 19th century, they would take a painting by Leonardo da Vinci. And when you read what they write, you can't tell whether they're describing the subject, the woman that's being painted, or the painting itself. So there's a big confusion in the world of aesthetics about differentiating between the subject that's been painted, and the painting itself. I honestly have to say about this question is that I just don't have a simple answer. But all I can tell you is that my sense is that it is something inside rather than outside in life.
Спасибо большое. Спасибо за ваши ответы и спасибо за беседу. Я хотел также поблагодарить наших переводчиков Оксану Якименко и Якова Подольного за их работу. И спасибо Владимиру Балабневу за его рассказ о книге и о работе. Спасибо Манежу за выставку и Магнуму.
Can I thank you, Igor?
Спасибо.
I thank you, Igor, and Vladimir, and the translators for helping to make this webinar happen. And it's been a pleasure to talk to you, to be here. Thank you.
Спасибо. И ждем всех на выставке. Жаль, что Стюарт не смог приехать. Спасибо.